Okay, so it is a little later. For today's work, we're going to be working with first scumbling. And scumbling is a controlled yet random movement of the brush across the surface of the paper. It is great for adding textures. It could be great for areas like foliage, possibly textures in a sky. And this is basically all scumbling is. It's kind of like the paintbrush is dancing across the surface of the watercolor paper. So you still want some control. You want to guide it where it goes. But it is a little bit more of a freer movement with your paintbrush. The next one we're going to move on to is pushing out pigment, which is this one down below, scumbling. For this one, I'm going to change to a flat brush. And pushing out pigment is another one that's great for textures. And basically what it is, it's a flick of your wrist. So you're going to have your flat brush once it's loaded up with paint, with the bristles facing towards you. And you're going to apply pressure to the bristles, and then you're just going to flick your paintbrush up. So it's just a flick of the wrist, and it does create some nice texture. So to demonstrate, I loaded up my paintbrush with some green paint. I'm going to touch it and flick, and flick, and flick, and flick. Okay, now you do have to be careful. Luckily, my wet on wet up there had some greens in it. So you do have to watch with the pigment you do apply to the paintbrush and where you're doing this at. I could also see this, you could try it with the flat edge of the paintbrush. Could give you a little bit more of a grass-like texture, but that is basically pushing out pigment. So I lay my paintbrush down, flick the wrist up. Next, we're going to move over to wipe out brush and Kleenex. Now for this one, we are going to once again apply some paint, a solid wash to our area. So I'm going to pick a color here, and I'm going to apply it. And while my paint is wet, this is another way I can add texture. It could be a opportunity to possibly pick up some paint where I don't want it. Now realize a lot of watercolor paints do stain your paper, but while it's wet, I can take a Kleenex and kind of touch it and pick up some pigment, so it can leave a little bit of texture on there. I can also do that with my paintbrush, and while the paint again is wet, I kind of dry out my paintbrush and I come in with it, and just like I showed you before to pick up puddles, it kind of picks up some of the paint. Notice how it's shrinking back in. So this could be another way to add some details to an area that you're painting. It could be a way to try to lift some paint if you feel you made a mistake. But again, it's not going to go back to white paper though if you do that. Or it could just be a way to add some value change to your area of paint. So kind of like erasing some of the pigment, but like I said, it will shrink back in because your paper is still wet. But that can be done with either Kleenex or paintbrush. Our next area we're going to look at is detail painting. And detail painting is basically careful, controlled, and deliberate strokes with your paintbrush. And it's going to depend on what you're using the paintbrush for, what your intended purpose is for applying paint in that area. And you can use any type of brush for details. Often we think of details coming with a fine detail brush or a thinner brush. So a smaller brush could be one in which we create some details. But whenever we talk about detail painting, it's specifically choosing a certain paintbrush and a certain stroke to add detail to an area of your painting. It's not scumbling, it's not random movements. It's careful, controlled, thought out movements. If I can find my other paintbrush, there it is. Okay, so that is detail painting. Right below it, we can talk about resist. And you may have used resist painting in elementary school. So resist is using some sort of substance that will stay on the paper. So it's not a version of masking fluid or tape in that eventually the tape and masking fluid get removed from your project. Resist though is using usually a wax-based material that will stay on the surface of the paper, but what it does is it resists the watercolor. It keeps it from penetrating the surface of the paper. So if you wanted something in a resist but not as noticeable, you could use white crayon. If you had a clear crayon, you could use it, but you could also use colors. And if you use colors, you just want to make sure it's going to be showing up. So you don't want, well, I guess you could, but it works best or looks best if you think of contrasting colors. So I'm applying some white here. I'm just doing some lines. I'm applying some blue now. And I'm going to then apply some paint over top of it. So since I used a blue color, I'm going to go in with an orange, since that is the complementary to blue. And I'm just going to paint over this area. And you can see how the watercolor runs off of the wax. My white there, I could have had a little bit more, obviously, where it's not resisting as well. But you can see where it's running off of the blue here. Some of the white, where I did get a little thicker, is working nicely. But that is an option also when you work with your watercolor paints, is you could use a resist method like this. And it could be a fun way to add patterns or details, again, in your drawing and your painting. Okay, so masking fluid is still drying for me. So I'm going to move on to hard and soft edges. So hard edges are basically ones we've been creating a lot of. This is where you have the wet paint up against the dry paper and the paint stops where you place it. Remember, we talked about how paint, when it's wet paper with wet paint on top, that paint will want to follow the wet paper, absorb into it. So a hard edge is easy to create in that we are just going to apply wet paint to our paper and create a nice clean hard edge, a nice very noticeable line to it. Soft edges are more created when you use some wet paper with the pigment. Now you could try spraying your paper where you want some soft edges, or you can just come in and wet the paper, come over to where you stopped with your paint, and let it just kind of bleed and flow over into that water. To create a little bit more of a soft edge. So it's just letting the paint kind of diffuse a little bit. Try to get it out of the light there. So you can see here where it's sprayed down here and where this is bleeding over this way. You're going to get a much softer edge to your paint than here where it's just the wet paint up against the dry paper. We'll do one more today, and that will be, you know what, in fact we're going to stop there. And that is because for the scratching wet and dry, you have to be able to apply the paint, but you have to let it start to dry for one of the techniques in this scratching area. So we're going to stop there for today, and we'll pick up here tomorrow and most likely go back to our masking fluid tape area tomorrow.